Hello and welcome to the LaFayette Club's online lecture series. My name is Harriet Allen and I'm here today in conversation with journalist and foreign affairs writer Tim Marshall. Mr. Marshall began his career in the newsroom, working his way up to researcher and then correspondent. He has reported from Europe, Asia and the US and worked as Middle East correspondent reporting from the Middle East. Mr. Marshall also reported from Serbia, Bosnia and Croatia during the Balkans Wars in the 1990s. He's worked extensively for Sky News and the BBC, and written for many British newspapers, including The Times, The Daily Telegraph, and The Guardian. Mr. Marshall has written many acclaimed books, including the international bestseller, Prisoners of Geography. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now let's begin with a first question about your background. So you say on your blog that you're an artist and decorator before you began your career as a journalist. How do you think that this artistic background has contributed to or affected your work as a journalist and perhaps your perspective on international relations?
Well, very limited in the first bit, but perhaps the perspective. I was a painter and decorator, but the painter as in painting houses and warehouses and factories on building sites. That I was a painter and decorator. I wasn't a painter and a decorator. So, you know, there's limited application of that to international relations and geopolitics. Perspective, though, is good because, you know, I come from that background, and hopefully it keeps you in touch and your feet on the ground. And, you know, it adds to experience, and it adds to what makes you up. So, I mean, I'm not saying that people that come through a much more traditional route are any better or worse qualified, but I don't think that having been a painter and decorator, having been on the building sites and many other jobs before I managed to get into journalism, hopefully it just adds to your hinterland.
Mm-hmm. So why did you decide to go to such unstable locations as a journalist?
I was sent there, but that's a bit disingenuous because you're only sent there if you want to go there. So I clearly wanted to. It stems back from childhood when I saw journalism. And for example, I listened to when I was about 12, I listened to the BBC radio recordings of the D-Day landings. And in my naivety, I thought, oh, that sounds fun. I mean, obviously, war is not fun, but it sounded exciting. And as a young person, you often want excitement. And I wanted to be a journalist from quite a young age, but I didn't get into it until I was, you know, older than most people. And I was always utterly fascinated by foreign news, international news, you know, the great sweeps of history. And of course, unfortunately, conflict is often the very sharp point of that. You know, I mean, we tend to demarcate time, obviously through the centuries. I mean, you know, one year is actually very little different to any other year, but, you know, we need a framework, so the 19th century, the 20th century. But we also demarcate it in times of great historical events, 1914 to 1918, 1939 to 1945, or 1989 and the end of the Cold War, 9/11. So we demarcate it. And I was aware that when it comes to conflict, these are some of the big demarcations in our history. And I'm afraid I was attracted to it, not really because of the excitement. I mean, I've met many of my colleagues, some of my colleagues down the years, that those of us that are not adrenaline junkies describe as adrenaline junkies. I think that's not a good reason to want to go there.
Mm-hmm. So one of these major periods you were in a dangerous country for was the Balkan War.
Mm-hmm.
And you covered this a lot in your book, Shadowplay, of course. This consists of your personal account of the war. Why did you decide to write the book like that rather than, for example, in sort of analytical history?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because actually I'd always said I was never going to write a book like that. I mean, I don't particularly like the journalistic war books that say we pulled on our flak jackets, it was door. You know, I don't like that. I hope, and thank you for reading Shadowplay, I hope that what I have done is through the personal narrative, I jump from it repeatedly into the contextual narrative of what was going on. And so, you know, it's not really autobiographical. I did put some of the adventures in it, and I hope, again, not in a self-aggrandizing manner, because I really don't like that. Again, amongst people that covered a lot of conflicts, if you get them in the same room, there's often a bit of one-upmanship. You know, one person tells a story and the other, oh, well, when I was in such and such. And I really don't like all that. So I hope I didn't do that. But I do hope that this, that the story is engaging. It's the only one I've ever done like that. I don't intend to do another one. But it just seemed, I just felt that on that particular occasion, my personal experiences could be a vehicle with which through to drive the whole story.
Do you think writing it in that style helps to reduce the distance between perhaps British readers who maybe feel a distance between ourselves and the Kosovo War?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think, you know, the personal account with the humanity and the interaction with the people that you meet in the stories, does help to reduce the distance, and it's not quite as abstract. I mean, I hope also in my other books that what I always try to do is to boil down sometimes relatively complicated concepts or strategies of countries into a very accessible manner, hopefully without dumbing it down. But you know, there isn't the sort of personal color stories. You can't do that. But in this particular one book, Shadowplay, I hope that the color helped bridge that gap. Yeah.
Yeah. So also in the book, and other authors and people have commented that Kosovo is the black hole of Europe.
Mm.
Can you explain why you think this or said this, and whether you would still label Kosovo as this?
Because it's been a flashpoint and a point of great tension. But I mean, that happens in a lot of places, including some very peripheral, or what to the core is peripheral. Obviously, it's not peripheral if you're living there. When you look at the geography of it, it's bang smack on the route for, unfortunately, people trafficking and drugs trafficking and all sorts of different smuggling. And that has helped it to remain a relatively unstable area, because a lot of frontiers in areas where the rule of law and advanced technological societies are not present, it tends to be fairly lawless, relatively lawless, I should say. And that has been the case for some time with Kosovo. What you now, and also it's also been on the fault line in the region of the fault line in Europe, where the Ottoman Empire and the Christian West did clash, and the ripples of that, we still feel them. So, and also, it is now a form of democracy, but it's one with very high levels of corruption. It's still awash with guns, I'm afraid, and it's still a little bit of a battlefield for other countries. I mean, Serbia and Kosovo itself, it's still very tense between them. And in the wider aspects, you still have the Turkey seeking influence in Kosovo because of the historic connections. Albania, obviously, because our Kosovo Albanians are ethnically Albanian. And so you mix all that up. And I mean, it's a bit rude to call it a black hole, but it is good shorthand for those complex problems.
So journalists face many risks in these type of war zones, as you did, especially in that area. Do you think those risks are worth enduring for the research and exposure that your journalism achieves?
Only if you survive them.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I mean, that's a really difficult subject, because, you know, each individual person has their own responsibilities, A, to the people around them, but also to their families back home. And it took me a long time to work out that the stress I was causing people back home. But without wanting to be too airy-fairy about it, there is such a thing as trying to tell people's stories and trying to explain what's going on in the world to people. And yes, it does come sometimes with risk. So I mean, going out the front door is risky. Obviously, it magnifies somewhat some places you go, but you just have to take as many precautions as you can. You have to trust the people around you, and the people that you come into contact with. And very, very importantly, you have to not be driven too much that you will take risks which just aren't worth taking. And again, some people have, I mean, many of colleagues I've known that have died, most of them, it just could have been anyone. There are one or two examples where bad decisions were made. And you always have to guard against it. I hasten to add, I don't do that stuff anymore. I've stopped.
Mm-hmm. Well, talking of, you've published many bestsellers. Why did you decide to publish books like Prisoners of Geography that are really accessible for the general public to understand geopolitics?
That was the aim, to do a geopolitical book in a very accessible manner that isn't written in the language of the high priests. All professions, trades even, have their own language, but I don't see the point in speaking that language to people outside of that profession if you're not a priest. Mm-hmm. And geopolitics is the same. I don't see the point in using the shorthands within the geopolitical communities. Or if you do, at least then explain what they are. I mean, a rather trite example, but it's the only one that comes to hand. I have heard sometimes on the television news, somebody will reference laissez-faire economics. Mm-hmm. And I always think, I always shout at the television, why are you speaking French? Because because if you come from an economic background, or a highly educated background, yeah, you know what laissez-faire economics is, but the people that you're broadcasting to don't, so why use that language? So I took that approach. The other thing was that I was very aware that one of the things that was most overlooked in reporting international relations was the geography of the story. Now, I don't argue it's the most important, I just say it's one of the most important, but it was the one that was overlooked so often. And I found over and over again, if you just inject a little bit of geographical reference about what is going on, you've gone a long way to explaining why it's going on. And that was the sort of inspiration for the book, and it seems to have worked.
Yeah, I read it before I started international relations at university, and it illuminated a lot of things and made me realize at least that I was more interested in international relations than politics and domestic issues. Mm. And I think a lot of my friends who do international relations would agree. So more on geopolitics. How do you think Britain's geographical position as an island on the edge of Europe has affected its European identity and attitude towards the European Union?
Yeah. Very much so, but perhaps most of us are not consciously aware of it. I think subconsciously it's in every single person in the country. We are an island. I mean, you know, this is not an argument for or against Brexit. I just think it's simply a reality that whichever your position is, you can't get past the fact that we all know we are an island, that it has influenced our history, that psychological thing of knowing that there is this water between us. Now, it can be bridged if you want it to be bridged in many ways, but psychologically, I think it's had a huge effect. I mean, it's plain that that water has separated us ideologically from the continent, because the continent has suffered much more upheaval, much more death and disaster, I'm afraid, over the past few centuries, which the UK has been protected from. And a large part of that protection has been because of the water. So I think that probably had an effect slightly on the Brexit vote. And also, people will think, well, as an island separate, we are free to look at 360 degrees. And I think that's also had an effect on how we think about the world. It's probably what's behind this new phrase, global Britain, which some people laugh at and some people think is a great idea. Island nations really are different. Mm-hmm. Japan is a very good example. The sea informs the collective hinterland, and if you look at many countries, Ethiopia, for example, if you look at the ethnic makeup of Ethiopia, you notice that in the east is the people that speak Somali, and next door others is Somali. Mm-hmm. And the ethnicities bleed across, which really impacts the politics of Ethiopia. And then you look up north and the ethnically towards the Eritrean border, people are Eritrean, etc., etc., etc. We don't really have that, and so there is more of a homogeneous aspect to the country. So all this stuff is, because of our geography. I don't think we even think about it, but it's certainly something that's worth discussing.
Also, you wrote the book, The Age of Walls, and that these walls we build up physically and we also build up in our minds based on our concept of us and them. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic is strengthening this divide between ourselves and the other? And how might that affect some nationalist and isolationist tendencies?
I think the majority effect of it will be, I'm afraid, to divide us further, but there is a caveat to that. Mm-hmm. But yes, there will be more of a suspicion of the other, this thing that's come from over there. And in popular parlance, people will still perhaps think of it as the Wuhan flu or the Chinese flu, because I don't know if you know, but the Spanish flu didn't come from Spain. You may know this, but it started during the First World War and then really hit in the year after 1919. But in the first year, everyone else was busy with the war, and then it hit Spain as badly as it hit anywhere else. But because they weren't in the war, there was a lot of media coverage about what was going on here. And so it became known as Spanish flu, and that stuck for a century. These things go deep. So I think there will be this residual suspicion of the other. The borders have gone up. They were already going up. COVID has magnified and accelerating existing trends. I don't think it's a massive game changer. Mm-hmm. Places like the Sahel, which are ravaged by climate change, ethnic conflict, international terrorism, you name it, they've got it. And the population movements there have been substantial, and a lot of people try to move northwards towards the richer Europe. Well, COVID-19 is going to exacerbate that existing trend and possibly send more people northwards. And I just don't think that in this current atmosphere, the response will be to open our arms. I think it'll be the opposite. So I think that's regularly replicated around the world, which I think is negative. The caveat is because there is also this idea that we are all in this globally, even though unfortunately almost every single response has been at nation state level. Almost every response in the EU has performed very badly, cohesively. Trump tried to persuade a German company, if you make this, we'll buy it now, sign here that you won't give it to the Germans. I mean, this is replicated all over the place. But the scientific community, I think we've realized that we need global responses, we need global research, we need to come together as a global family to try to challenge this. So at a sort of intellectual, emotional level, I think it might reinforce those of us that think you do need global responses to global problems. Mm-hmm. But that's a sidebar. I think it's more or less negative.
So do you see the pandemic, well, what will probably be future waves of the pandemic and our future with Brexit, how do you think that will evolve over the next year? And also, being in St Andrews, we think a lot about the Scottish position and how that might have changed.
Yeah, the second one I think is significant. I don't think there's particular influence on Brexit. I think the ship has sailed. I don't think it's about to turn back into harbour. Mm-hmm. The current administration will seek to cooperate on this example and go its own way on that example. I don't think there's that much of an effect. I think the increasing dissension within the European Union has been magnified, though. As for the Scottish question, I mean, I've argued since the Brexit vote that I don't see how independence cannot come back onto the radar, given the demographics of the vote. And so it has come to pass. And of course, the Scottish nationalist is not about to say, well, all right, I'll give up. Of course not. And they've kept going. And it was only a matter of time. But what Brexit has done is also, again, it's magnified and accelerated. I don't know if you've noticed, but I think it's only since COVID that we have routinely in the media started to refer to the nations of the UK. That's fairly new. Now, it's always been there ever since devolution and other things. There have always been these four nations that make up the state. But it's not come into popular parlance until COVID because of the different responses, the Scottish response, the Northern Ireland response. And now we talk about the nations, and I think this idea of how separate we might be is pushed more into our consciousness, and I think the Scottish nationalists can play on that. I mean, a lot of it is propaganda. I mean, the responses have not been that different. There still has been a UK-wide response, but I don't blame Mrs. Sturgeon for her actions. She's a politician doing what she can for her particular cause. So, sorry, it's a very long-winded answer. In a nutshell, I think it has increased our perceptions of our divisions.
Okay, great. Meanwhile, China and India have been skirmishing over their disputed border. Can you offer any thoughts on the recent events and tension between the two during this time?
Again, this is in COVID-related terms. It is accelerated and magnified an existing problem. I mean, they've been having issues up there for years. They fought a war, an Aksai-Chin in 1962, very brief war, very limited. China took advantage while the world's attention was elsewhere, not just Aksai-Chin and this awful fatalities that they suffered up there. They sank a Vietnamese fishing vessel. They chased a Malaysian oil surveillance ship out of the seas. They sailed their aircraft carrier group right around Taiwan. They're allowed to do it, but they know what they're doing. It is seen as provocative. Mm-hmm. And they did it when the American carriers were in dock, one having repairs and the other because it was stricken with COVID. And at each point they were saying, we're over this and we're in charge in our region. So that's the context in which you put what happened on the border between them. And it's not a coincidence that a month, 6 weeks on, and this is where the real flashpoint may lie, not in the Himalayas, but in the Indian Ocean. The Americans and the Indians are going into a joint naval exercises. It's quite new, this. There's something called the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, US. It's a very odd coming together of countries, but it plays into this old concept that's come into fashion, Indo-Pacific region. Yet you see the whole region as a single entity. And I think the Chinese behavior has accelerated this trend that was coming together of those four countries. And there's now also something called the Quad Plus. They're thinking of pulling in South Korea and maybe even New Zealand into it. Mm-hmm. So you see new alliances emerging in response to new perceived threats. And that is the context in which to look at what happened in the Himalayas.
Mm-hmm. And as for the Middle East, Trump has been pulling out troops from Afghanistan. Do you think that this will have long-term effects in the region, or do you think with a new if the US get a new administration, will they maybe reverse these changes and build a more aggressive foreign policy?
Americans want out. They want out of Afghanistan. They want out of Syria. Syria is easier. They just don't care. They don't care about Syria. It is not strategically particularly important for them. I mean, they would prefer if they could dominate it, but they're so disinterested in it that the Russians said, great, a geographic space that we can jump into and mess up the Americans, even if they don't really care. They don't care about Syria. And they think it's Europe's problem, which it is. Afghanistan is different because strategically it's slightly more important for them, but they call it their forever war. They want out. Biden will want out. The administration wants out. Congress wants out. And again, I've argued ever since they drew down in 2016, I said they will settle for holding Kabul and parts of the north. Thereby they can pretend there's a unitary state and all their efforts were not in vain. And the Taliban can take most of the south, which they've already done. The Americans won't go completely, but even under Biden, they do not want to spend any more blood and treasure there. The pivot to Asia is real. That's where they feel the action is. They have, as a global power, you keep an eye on everywhere, but your bandwidth is limited, and there is extremely limited bandwidth for Syria, some for Afghanistan, some for Europe, and an awful lot for Asia. So, no, I think again the train is leaving the station on this one.
And building on Syria, how do you see the situation there progressing, perhaps in the next few years?
Well, Assad's won a Pyrrhic victory. The old Romans saying they made a desert and called it victory. So he's helped make a desert out of that country and calls it victory. I got this right and wrong. I got it right at the beginning because I said he wouldn't lose. And I was called an Assad apologist. I said, I'm not on anyone's side here. I'm just looking at the demographics and the firepower. And he's not going to lose. He's not going to be overthrown. The Russians saved him. Where I got it wrong is I thought that even though he wouldn't lose, that Syria its future would be a series of regional warlords controlling various areas. And it hasn't turned out that way. He is the biggest warlord, which I said he would be, but he's the warlord of nearly the whole country. I didn't think he could get back all the territory he's got back. He has, with Russian and Iranian and Hezbollah's help. So the Iranians will draw down. Hezbollah has already drawn down. The Russians are in. They have their port, which they're reinforcing. They have their air base now on a 100-year lease. The Turks are going to stay there as well, but they can come to an agreement. Turks and the Russians. You've got your port and airfield on the Mediterranean. We've got our buffer zone between us and the Kurds. So you can freeze the conflict, which is pretty much where it's at. It's more or less frozen. Very little space for ISIS to come back as a genuine force. They're always going to be around, bleeding people. But no, you can freeze it. We always think of things in terms of solutions. What we don't think of is that for some people, freezing something is a solution. And I think this will be a frozen conflict, which occasionally will flare up. But the lines are more or less set at the moment.
Okay, well that's great. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our interview today. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Marshall. It was an honor.
Thank you. Can I just end on a positive note? I mean, I've spent half an hour talking to you about death and disaster. This is because these are the areas we've been looking at. You look overall at the world, pretty good place, getting better for most people. Clearly issues you have to deal with, but please don't leave this being depressed. The world continues to be a better place for more and more people.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.